The fact that Professor Simons held a deep love for Canada is no surprise to anyone who knew him. Indeed, the breadth of his commitment to almost every facet of Canadian life was remarkable. From 1968 to 75, he served as the chairman of the Policy Advisory Committee for Robert Stanfield, Leader of the Opposition. From 1972 to 75, he famously led a National Commission on Canadian Studies. Its published findings, entitled To Know Ourselves, or the Simons Report, inspired a generation of scholars, policymakers, and citizens dedicated to the study of Canada. In 1976, his efforts led to his investment as a member of the Order of Canada, later promoted to Companion, and later his election as a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada. He served as chairman on numerous federal committees and institutions, including the National Commission on Canadian Studies, the National Library Advisory Board, and the Historic Sites and Monuments Board of Canada. He also served on the National Statistics Council of Canada, the Canada Council, the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, and many others. Additionally, a medal and an annual lecture entitled the Simons Lecture on the State of Canadian Confederation were created in his honor at the Confederation Centre of the Arts on Prince Edward Island. In 2016, Professor Simons received the Gabriel Léger Medal from the National Trust for Canada in recognition of his lifetime contribution and leadership in heritage conservation in Canada. It was under Professor Simons that Trent University created the first Indigenous Studies program in the country, soon followed by the Canadian Studies program and the groundbreaking Journal of Canadian Studies.
I think Tom Simons is synonymous with Canadian culture and Canadian studies. The name of Tom Simons is integral, and as his life was integral into Canadian studies and the study of Canadian culture. Tom Simons was born in a really transitional era, that brought us through the Second World War. And before the Second World War, in fact, there weren't Canadian citizens. And Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister, was Canadian citizen number one. And so Tom Simons got to see this transition close up, a Canada that through its metal in conflict, through its expansion in population, through its growing culture, was getting a deeper sense of what it was. And Tom Simons was on the front lines of that. Now, the Massey Commission was huge, and it was the first real documentation of where Canada should be as a cultural place, and where it is and where it should go. And then Tom Simons, a decade later, was instrumental in the creation of Trent University, a university that could make the rubber hit the road in many ways. And indeed, he did that, right? Because he created the first school for Indigenous studies in the country. And he created one of the first schools of Canadian studies in the country, and made Canadian studies a topic worth exploring. And these were all institutions, of course, that were very near and dear to his heart. He was the chair of the National Historic Sites and Monuments Board. He was the chair of the Ontario Heritage Trust. His work with the National Library, with StatsCan, you name it. If there was a Canadian institution that embraced culture and embraced what Canada was, Tom Simons not only was a part of it, he probably often chaired it or ran it, which is such an important legacy of his.
This is such a bittersweet moment for me as I think about Professor Tom Simons. I have known him for decades, actually, when I was involved in culture and education matters for the province of Saskatchewan. And he was first introduced to me as Mr. Canadian Studies. And that has always stuck with me. It is important because he was recognized as the person who challenged all of us to think about what it means to be a Canadian.
I was privileged to be Trent's liaison on the Simons Commission, the To Know Ourselves committee on the study on Canadian studies back in the 1970s, early 1970s. And if you go through the recommendations of the report, if you go through it, it's just replete with recommendations for stepping past the accepted protocols for academic life that have been ordained by British and American universities. He was adamant that Canada should be developing its own ways of looking at the world and our place in it. And he wanted to make sure that we were aware of the richness and of the cultures that were here, and certainly especially the richness of the culture that we were introduced to, that was the hospitality that welcomed people who came from other places to live here. So the importance of Indigenous issues, the importance of Indigenous studies, the importance of the privilege of entering into this world had to be also paralleled in academic discourse by an awareness that there were different ways of looking at things. And I'll give you one example because it became a guide for everything that happened in the program that I was involved in, and that was introducing interdisciplinarity into the academic discourse. Canadian Studies program was the first interdisciplinary program at the university, and we were starting green from scratch, basically. And Tom, if you read his document, you will find references to trying new methodologies, new theoretical tools that spontaneously sprang from the place that we occupy here, and learning from the culture. First of all, the cultures that were our guides to life. The initial occupants of the land. We had to learn from them.